Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about the scientific method. So, there will probably be times where you hear me call it scientific inquiry, which is the same thing. Inquiry just means you're curious about something. Um, you want to know the answer to it, you ask a question. So, the scientific method is actually a set of steps that scientists use to conduct investigations or experiments. So, pretty much this entire year, as we go through and we do labs and things, we will use the scientific method. So, there's 6 steps that we're going to talk about. And as I go through, I'll explain what each step means, give you an example of a couple of them. And then when we're done, you'll have an assignment in your interactive notebook to complete. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with step number 1. So step number 1 is simply to ask a question. So that means you're going to start off your experiment by asking a question that can be solved with an experiment or an investigation. So let's say that we are going to do an experiment where we're growing our own plants. Okay. Your question may be, can a plant grow without sunlight? So we may be doing 2 separate things. You may be growing a plant that has water only. You may be growing a plant that has sunlight only. Or maybe you were going to grow a plant that had water and sunlight. So your question may be, can a plant grow without sunlight? So your question has to be something that can be answered by what you're going to be doing in your experiment. So let me give you an example of a not good question to ask. So if you were to ask, why is the sky blue? We can't answer that by just doing a lab experiment in class. We can't do that. So that would be a question that would not be a good example. So when you ask your question, you have to think about it and think about something that will actually work with your experiment. So step 2, make a hypothesis. So I like the word hypothesis. I think it's a cool word. So a hypothesis is actually an educated guess. So pretty much you ask your question. Next step, you make your hypothesis and you say what you think will happen. Okay? So this is not you're always going to get it right thing. Sometimes you make a hypothesis and you're totally wrong, but that's okay. So what you do is you make your hypothesis and you make an educated guess about what you think the answer to your question will be. So, for example, in the last one, when I asked, can a plant grow without sunlight? My hypothesis might be no, a plant cannot grow without sunlight. So it's simple. It's really straightforward, 1 or 2 sentences at the most. So you ask your question, then you make your hypothesis. You guess, you think about what you think is going to happen, and then you make that hypothesis. Step 3, obviously plan your experiment. Okay, so you're writing out the steps for your experiment and you're gathering all of the materials that you're going to need. So when I think of this step, it reminds me of a recipe. Because when you look at a recipe, it has certain steps that you have to have, okay? Certain steps you have to do in a certain order. And it also gives you a list of materials that you're going to need. So you go out before you let's say you're making some brownies. Before you make those brownies, you go and you gather all your materials, and then you look at the steps, you look at the actual recipe, and you go through and you do those steps in order. That way your brownies come out the best they can be. So that's what I want you to think about when you think about planning your experiment. You think about a recipe. Have all your materials and have your steps written out. This is also important because if somebody else wanted to do your experiment after you did and you left out an important step, they wouldn't get the same results that you did. So this is important that you write everything down and get all of your materials together. Next is step 4. So this is where you collect and record your data. Data is just the information that you're collecting. So this is when you do the actual experiment. This is the real deal. You're following that recipe that you just made. You're following those steps, and you're actually conducting the experiment. Now, while you are doing the experiment, this is when you want to collect and record your data or your information, because what might happen if you don't do that while you're doing your experiment and you had 15 measurements that you had to make, and then all of a sudden you get done and you can't remember all 15 measurements. So that's why when you do an experiment, you collect as you go. You write it down as you go. That way you don't forget anything. So I know it says record your data. So this could mean a couple of different things here. This could mean you write it down on a piece of paper. It could mean you're actually recording yourself, you're videoing yourself while you're doing the experiment. So it could mean a lot of different things right now. But this is a super important step also. So the next step is step number 5. Step number 5 is analyze your data. So analyze just means to discover or reveal information through an experiment. So in step number 4, you collected everything and you wrote it down. Step number 5 is where you're actually going to put everything together into a table or a graph that makes sense. So depending on what type of data you collected, it may be a pie chart. It might be a bar graph. It may just be a table that has all kinds of numbers and stuff in it. So it just depends on what type of experiment you're doing, and what would be appropriate for your set of data. So the last step number 6, is communicate your results. Everyone should know communicate means that you're telling something to someone else. You're communicating. So this just means that you're coming to a conclusion about your experiment, and then you're going to report your findings. So this is where you would explain whether your hypothesis was correct or not. So after you conducted your experiment, you would figure out if you were right or you were wrong about your hypothesis. It's okay if you're wrong. It's not a big deal. It happens all the time. If your hypothesis is wrong, you could go back and redo the experiment and change your hypothesis, but you don't always have to. And so where you would report your findings, this is where a lot of lab reports come in. This year, we're going to try to do one lab report. That way you can kind of get the hang of it, because once you get to high school, you'll do quite a few lab reports. And these are important. That's the way that you communicate what happened in your experiment with your teacher, your professor, your other peers who may want to do the same experiment that you did. So those are the 6 steps of the scientific method. So now your assignment. So we're going to go back to, again, your interactive notebook. If you notice, this is kind of a common theme here. Interactive notebook. So if you go to your table of contents, right here, scientific method, slide number 5 is where we're going. So it looks like this. So what you're going to do is define and explain each part of the scientific method. So in order, this has to be in order, you're going to write the name of the step and what it means. Okay, so you'll write the name of the step and you'll write what it means. And so there's 6 boxes here. Remember, there's 6 steps that we talked about. So you can refer back to the slideshow that I was just showing you. That'll be available to you, so you can go back and look at that if you need to. But again, write the name of the step and what it means. And I don't mean write step 1, step 2. What are you actually doing during that step? Okay, so for example, step number 1 was ask a question. So right here, you would type ask a question, and then you would explain what that means. Okay, so when you're done with this, again, you'll screenshot just this one page, and you will send it or attach it to your Google Classroom assignment. And that'll be it. But again, if you have any questions, just let me know and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Y'all have a good day.